Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Great. This is a great crowd. We start with a nice, bright and cheery good morning. So welcome to the session on Neighborhood by the Numbers. My name is Karen Leone, and I'm from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and I'm really pleased to be joining you today, and I'm also really pleased to be on this panel. I have the honor of introducing our panelists and doing a little bit of stage setting and telling you a little bit about how we're going to run this session. So let me just introduce our panelists first. First, you're going to hear from Ira Goldstein, who I'm sure many of you know. He's with the Reinvestment Fund, TRF, and I'm going to point you to the bios in your binder for more information, but in a second I'm going to tell you why I think I'm really excited about this panel, and it'll be a little bit about each of our speakers. This next person you're going to hear from is Paul Brophy from Brophy and Reilly, and then finally you'll hear from Michael Braverman from the City of Baltimore. And what I think is really exciting about this panel is that you have an opportunity to hear from the spectrum of data people, of data geeks. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. But
proud of that.
I'm a Georgia Tech alumni, and we very proudly call ourselves the Nerd Nirvana, so I feel like data geeks is okay. So what I think is so exciting about this panel, though, is that you're going to first hear from somebody who talks about the methods, the process, the quality of the data, and starts off by developing the tools to use data. And then you're going to hear from somebody who is a great coach, is great at getting in there and talking with organizations and helping them think long-term and strategically about what data can do for them if they do something for the data. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then finally, you're going to hear from Michael, who is helping to change the culture of an organization to say, data is important, data can help us make really good decisions, data can help us be more efficient. And so I think that spectrum of experts on this panel is going to help give a really interesting look at using data in community development organizations, in cities, in financial institutions from a lot of different perspectives. And what I'm excited about is when you ask the questions, I know we'll have people here who can answer them, not me. But what I wanted to just start with, because you're going to hear a lot about using data and market-based strategies to effectively make economic development decisions in your communities. But what I kind of first want to start it by doing is talking a little bit about this journey from data to directions and kind of set a context for this discussion. And so, first of all, everybody here has good intentions, right? What community developer doesn't have good intentions? We're all out there, and unfortunately, I think our good intentions are one of the hardest things we have to deal with because we want to do everything, everywhere, for everyone. And so, first, you got to kind of think about the data journey that you could go on that will help you kind of take your good intentions to somewhere that has a lot of impact and a lot of meaning. So first of all, thinking about how you articulate and prepare to invest in those goals. We heard from some great people yesterday. We heard a lot of discussions about, in the last session, in our plenary session, know what you want to accomplish. When you have a developer who wants to come in and do a project with you, or you're setting up a policy, be really clear about the outcomes you're trying to accomplish. It's the same thing with data, because there's a lot of data out there. There's a ton of data out there. There's a ton of ways to analyze it. There's a ton of ways to think about it. And there's a lot of noise in that data. And unfortunately, all of that noise can mean that you get the junk in, junk out scenario, where you do a lot with a lot of data, and in the end, you don't have what you need to make really good decisions. So step 2 on the data journey, as I see it, is you got to clean and test your data. You're probably going to be dealing with some really interesting and unique administrative data, perhaps qualitative data, self-generated data, big data that everyone hears about and comes with a whole set of limitations and opportunities, and knowing how to get it prepared to use is critically important. But to do that, finding the pioneers and the advisors. Some of these folks here, these are some of the pioneers and the advisors. Copying, collaborating, and commiserating with these folks is the way to make data work for you and to think about it in different ways and be more efficient about how you tackle it. So you do the data analysis then, and finally you ground truth it. Did the data tell you something that you actually believe? And if you don't believe it, how do you test? If you look at it and you're like, gosh, I can't believe that's actually true about this neighborhood. Go out into the community and find out, because data methods and analysis sometimes lead you in directions that don't always make sense. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes they highlight something you've missed all along. But other times, there may have been a different path you could take to really understand the issues. And that's part of the science of this. This is the science of creating this information where you track conditions, you understand your context, you can look at trends and directions and comparisons, and it should be unbiased and rigorous and all of those things that every academic will talk to you about. But then there's the art. And for the folks who went to the art session this morning, this is where it's the creativity. Because data needs to speak to people. It needs to mean something, and it needs to motivate action. And it needs to convince your decision makers that there's a reason to do something and a reason to believe in it, and there's an art in telling that story. And finally, all of that is kind of held together by a disciplined culture and infrastructure. And this is where I kind of started off by saying, be prepared to invest in the goals. Because developing the disciplined culture to say data is important and we're going to build in and address kind of the political concerns of data, the cultural concerns of data, and what it's telling us, there's a lot of investment in kind of shifting that culture. And at times there can be a lot of infrastructure. And that infrastructure is human infrastructure to collect and use the data, but it can also be the technological infrastructure that actually makes the data accessible and pulled together and making sense. And in the end, ultimately, what you're trying to do is just strategically inform action. So from taking those great intentions, that 100 great intentions you started out with, and coming to some conclusions and bringing with you an evidence base that says, okay, these are my strategically informed actions. This is the things I'm going to do, and I feel pretty good about my chances of success. And so I just lay this out for you this morning to kind of give a framework to think broadly about data. And what I'm excited now to do, though, is to pass it on to Ira, who has thought long and hard about developing that infrastructure and that process and that rigor that gets from great intentions to informed actions. And so with that, I'm just going to turn it over.
Thanks. Well, good morning. Welcome to Philadelphia if you're not from here. Good to see you if you are from here. Actually, I don't need that. Thanks. So I think oftentimes the measure of a good introduction is when what's said in that introduction really rings true for so many pieces of what it is that I want to speak about. And Karen's introduction really did do a terrific job in terms of highlighting some of the important things that I hope to make sure that I hit on as I go through. Just briefly, and you'll see it in the bio, I'm from an organization called the Reinvestment Fund. We are a local CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution. We're certified by the Treasury, and you can think of us in the briefest of terms as investors with a public purpose. And I would say that we use data both to drive our investing activity, and we use data to understand how it is that we are impacting the people in the communities that we intend to impact with those investments. And so a lot of what you're going to see today really is the result of some data and analytic innovations that we engaged in when we were brought in to work with the city of Philadelphia, right around calendar year 2001, when Philadelphia was trying to figure out essentially how to take the terrific vitality that some of you saw our former governor Ed Rendell was able to sort of create in the downtown of Philadelphia, and draw some of that really neat life and vitality and community rebirth up into the neighborhoods of the city of Philadelphia. He did the great job in the downtown, and his successor really started to sort of bring that stuff up into the neighborhoods, which was absolutely necessary at the time. We do this really with an idea of places being markets, and the idea is to understand those markets as best as you can and to operate in a way that facilitates the proper functioning of those markets so that as you make your investments, you're not in there alone. You're making investments with an eye towards creating the variety of things in the variety of places and the market wind and pressure that's necessary to revitalize places. So we created this thing called a market value analysis, or MVA. It is a database tool that uses a variety of administrative data sources. When I say administrative, I mean by that data that cities and counties and states generate and keep on their own. We generally don't use an awful lot of census data or secondary data sources for this purpose, although occasionally we will supplement and overlay those data on top of the administrative data. We actually prefer the administrative data, not always because it's cleaner or more available, because it's not always, but it tends to be very timely, it tends to be very granular, and oftentimes it tends to be more representative of what kinds of decisions people are making on the ground in the moment. And so you can think of the MVA as a tool that private sector actors and government officials use to be able to understand the markets that they're operating in and craft interventions that are tailored to the existing conditions on the ground. We've done this work in a variety of cities, Philly several times, Pittsburgh several times, Baltimore several times, and then a variety of places that range from New Orleans that you heard about in this room just a few moments ago, to Detroit, to Milwaukee, which you'll hear about in a moment, to St. Louis. And each one of these places, as we do this work, I find that it makes us a little better at understanding because, as Karen said, all these things really are a function of a little bit of art and a little bit of science, and being able to bring to bear a broader base of experience, I think, allows you to do a better job with both the art and the science piece. Like any analysis, we have a variety of assumptions that go into it. I feel like it's important to always be transparent about those things, about those assumptions. And so we start with this. Generally speaking, we're looking at, in the case of the MVA, a tool that's used to help drive where subsidy or investment may go. And you heard about New Orleans, and that was billions, but at least going back to the Philadelphia story, back to 2001, our mayor was looking at spending about $250 million on blight in the city of Philadelphia at that time to treat the conditions related to blight. And that sounds like an awful lot of money, but in a city the size of Philadelphia, you could spend that money and have no apparent evidence other than the receipts, quite frankly, if it wasn't done well. Right? I mean, it's a big city. We're 600,000 households at this point, plus or minus a few. So you could spend that $250 million in awful bad ways and not see any evidence. And so the idea was to really sort of think about subsidy as being scarce, and it can't create a market. But what it can do is it can be used to leverage or clear the path for private investment. Next, no city that we've ever worked in, be it Detroit or New Orleans or St. Louis or Philly or Baltimore or Pittsburgh or any of the cities, or Milwaukee for that matter, is there any shortage of distressed places. So it's not like you're going to run out of choices if you're trying to find a place that you want to work in. The idea, though, is to find the nodes of strength within those distressed places and invest into those. So in other words, this is going to take the typical paradigm, which is to find the biggest crater of distress, find the epicenter of it, and try and invest your way out of that. It takes that and sort of turns it on its head. It says where that body of distress exists, find within it nodes of strength, find proximate markets that you could essentially draft off of, find the things that make sure that you're not the only actor in there, and invest into those. We also believe that when you're dealing with a city, that all parts of the city are customers for the goods and services and programs and resources and planning and all the other things that cities and investors do. And so the critical thing is to essentially tailor the activities and the programs and services and the like to the conditions on the ground. And lastly, this was a controversial one in Philly. You ought to make decisions based in data. It's less so of a controversial decision today than it was back in 2001. But it's not the way that government's always operated, quite frankly. And I don't know what cities you're all from, but I'm sure you've all had experiences like that. that it's not necessarily the objective conditions on the ground that drive decisions. So how do we do this? We get a slew of data of a variety of different kinds, typically from the local government. We spend an awful lot of time cleaning and geocoding that data. When I say we spend a lot of time cleaning it, we do it a couple different ways. We do it through the visual display of it and then vetting it with local subject matter experts. And we will also do it by going into the place we're working, spending time driving up and down the cities, the streets in the city that we're working with data on the laptop, identifying if something says it's a $500,000 sale, could it actually be a $500,000 sale? So we spend an awful lot of time doing that kind of work because we do believe that garbage in is garbage out. And contrary to what you may have been taught in school or what the practice of some of the finest economists of the world may be, the fact of the matter is you can't overcome bad data with sophisticated statistics. And so if you have bad data, no matter what kind of statistics you use, you're going to get a bad result. And so we spend an awful lot of time making sure those data are clean. We operate at the level of the city block group. You can think of those as being about a fifth or a sixth of a census tract. And we like that geography for the purposes of our work because it generally will relate to what you might see if you were walking down the street. If you go from one neighborhood to the next and you see change, it'll be reflected in a block group, and it really won't be so well reflected in a census tract. We take the data, we map it to the block group, we conduct our analysis, which is a statistical cluster analysis, which is a fancy statistical technique on clean data, though. A fancy statistical technique that allows you to sort places out based on the common set of characteristics. So within each grouping of places, you'll have very common characteristics, but across the groupings, you'll see that they look very different. And we map that, and then we drive and validate that too. So we want to make sure that as we see something change on the map, we see it on the ground being different, and vice versa. So that's the process. The market data that we use, you should not think of the exhaustive list of things that one might use to think about investment, but think of it as a representative list of things. And so we use sale prices. We don't use census home values. We use sale prices because those generally relate to what people are actually willing to pay for property in a transaction, in a real transaction. And so if you were to compare, for example, census home value data in the city of Detroit to transaction data, what you'd find is they're off by orders of magnitude, and they don't even correlate all that well. So in other words, actual transactions in a place like Detroit might be in the $7,000 to $10,000 range. Census data shows it in the $80,000 to $90,000 range. And the areas that necessarily seem high in the census are not necessarily what are the highest prices based on the transactions. You have to use the transactions. They really are a critical indicator. We use a measure of the variability of sales. We look at, and this is the data that we used in Milwaukee. Because of the nature of the housing stock there was a lot of multifamily and duplex and condo. We put a differentiator in for that. We look at foreclosures as a percentage of sales. We looked at utility shutoffs as a measure of vacancy. We look at tenure. That is the only variable that we ever really look at when it comes to the census, because there tends not to be in any municipality good data on tenure. Municipalities tend not to know where owners and renters live necessarily, even though most municipalities will have landlord licensing and registration. We use new construction, and we use the ratio of commercial to developed area. This is the generalized packet. From city to city, it may change a little bit based on the nature of what we see there. I'm just going to run through a couple of the maps of Milwaukee to give you a sense as to how it lays out. This is a map of price, and the darkest shaded areas are the highest prices, and they're about $250,000 and above. Those tend not to be super high prices. It's not a very high-priced market, all right? But at the lower end, which is the lighter shaded areas, you're looking at under $40,000. This is variability of price. The darkest shaded areas are places where prices are most variable. The variability of price is interesting because it oftentimes serves as a marker of where markets are in a state of change. These are foreclosures as a percentage of sales. If you look at some of the darkest shaded areas here, you're looking at where 60, 70, 80% of the sales are associated with foreclosures. So that's pretty high. pretty high for any city, actually. This is where the rental stock has a higher percentages or lower percentages of subsidy attached to it. Where it's most darkly shaded, that's where you're seeing the highest concentrations of subsidized rental housing. New construction, again, the darkest shaded areas are the places where the new construction is going on. And these are the characteristics of the markets, excuse me, as we sort of sort them out. What you'll notice here is that a lot of these, first of all, they're ordered by sale price. And sale price is a very heavy driver of any of the market analyses that we do. But once you get past sale price, you'll notice that the markets don't necessarily, that the variables don't track linearly. So in other words, you will find in Milwaukee, as we did in other cities, that, for example, the strongest real estate market, I'll give you an example of the other day, the strongest real estate market in the city of St. Louis and the most distressed real estate market in the city of St. Louis had the absolute identical owner occupancy rate. So it's not that owner occupancy is good and renter occupancy is bad, or vice versa. This technique allows the market to really sort of sift and sort itself out without giving any generalized grade to what any of the particular variables mean. But what is important is to understand that constellation, because you invest into that constellation of characteristics. And this is the market analysis for the city of Milwaukee. The area, and by the way, we're doing this very quickly. Paul is going to talk to you a little bit about how he sort of took the analysis and did the implementation based on it. But this is a market where the purple are some of the strongest real estate markets. The reds are some of the more distressed real estate markets. Some of the things that we tend to look at when we're thinking about both validation and implementation is the intersection of where you see markets of different types in very close proximity to each other. Oftentimes those represent terrific opportunities for investing where you can draft off of strength of an existing proximate real estate market. But you will see that there are, large swaths of area where the markets don't vary all that much, but actually, if you were to look in some very specific places, literally maybe only about 6, 8, 10, 12 blocks square, you might actually be seeing 4 or 5 different real estate markets. And again, the differences that you see, those internal differences, even in a very small place, are very important in terms of crafting the right intervention strategy that goes along with it. Again, the way people are using this across the country is to prioritize resources. We are now starting to sort of expand our look, so we're now not only paying attention to the characteristics of the housing market, but also things like, essentially, how do you think about the intervention strategies? This is a very sort of stylized grid, although not stylish grid. It's a stylized grid that sort of gives you a sense as to how you might use the thing. The idea would be to say, look at the columns, each one representing a different kind of characteristic of the real estate market. The rows representing a variety of different things that cities will typically do. These things in gray might be the things that a sort of a housing or a code enforcement unit might do. These things in yellow might be the kinds of things that a philanthropy might do. These things in sort of the khaki tones might be things that sort of a community service entity might do. And the idea would be to sort of bring all those actors together, as they did in Milwaukee with philanthropy and government and investors and CDFIs and the like, and really start to think about, essentially, how do we both prioritize these different things in places, and how do we think about creating a set of complementary strategies so that if government's doing something in one place, philanthropy is not duplicating it, it's doing something else that's necessary in another place. In other words, get everybody on the same data-based page so that people are making decisions about what they want to do and how they want to do it in a sort of collective and transparent way. As I said, we're starting to look at additional things now as overlays to the market analysis. Those would be sort of quality of life things, quality of life-related dimensions. There we're looking at issue areas such as public safety, the quality and access to education, to public education. What are the quality and availability of the amenities that you might see in a place? What about the level of prosperity that you might see in an area? What does the local commerce looks like in a place? And, of course, the housing measures. So if you think about those things laid on top of the market analysis, that really does start to give you a very good roadmap into how you set one of these collective strategies for investment and cooperation. And with that, I will stop and pass to Paul Brophy.
Good. Good morning. Nice to be with you. I'm going to pick up exactly where Ira left off because I want to give you the Milwaukee context for this discussion. But first, let me know a little bit about you as we talk about this. For those of you who are working either in a city or are working with a set of cities, how many of those of you in that situation are working with cities that are kind of trying to define their future economically, that they're trying to fight off decline in cities? How many of you are in that category? Right? And how many of you are working in cities where the key issue is rampant growth and you're trying to figure out how to deal with kind of affordable housing in that context? Okay? A few. Okay? So I asked that question because I think there are considerably different kind of strategies about using data that come out of the data analysis in those kind of places. And the Milwaukee situation, what Ira's been describing, are more applicable to those of you like myself working in cities that are struggling to figure out how they can hold their population, how they can increase their property values, how they can build their economic base, and so on. And that's the kind of city that Milwaukee is, all right? And that's the kind of city that Baltimore is. I mean, kind of it's, and Philadelphia is, and Pittsburgh is. These are the cities that I have spent my career working in. And I'm currently calling those cities legacy cities, all right? We tried the weak market cities thing, and no mayor wanted to be mayor of a weak market city, you know. And we tried older industrial cities, but not all of them are older industrial cities. So we found this term legacy cities that we're trying to use. So what I was showing is market data, and the Milwaukee story kind of goes like this. In 2011, there were a group of foundations and a couple of companies that had been making investments in Milwaukee neighborhoods, and they realized that they really didn't have a strategy. They were doing things primarily because they were trying to ameliorate poverty in the city's most distressed neighborhoods, which is a good thing to be doing. And yet they said, well, we're not sure we're getting kind of the bang for our buck. We're fairly certain we're not getting any synergy at all because we're barely talking with each other. They asked me to come in and kind of help them assess what the situation is and how they could get more synergy among themselves and greater kind of intersection between the foundations and other sectors like city government and state government, and how they could align themselves with what was happening at the grassroots level in the neighborhoods. It's a city that's got a stable population. It lost a tiny bit over the past 15 years. It does have, like many of these cities do, a good in-migration of millennials, kind of young people, professionals, kind of moving into and strengthening some neighborhoods. It's got lots of strong neighborhoods, as Ira indicated. However, in the MVA, lots of very weak neighborhoods. So all the red are deeply distressed neighborhoods. The oranges are not quite in that category, but you can see there's a substantial amount of very distressed neighborhoods. And Milwaukee ranks, I think, either highest or near highest in the nation of central cities with very high racial segregation index. Kind of, you got a real divide between whites and blacks. There's a growing Hispanic population, but this is largely a city that's been a kind of a white-black city over the years. So this invite comes from the foundations to figure things out, and there's 3 or 4 foundations that are very crucial. LISC has a very strong program in Milwaukee, working primarily in the distressed neighborhoods, and want to figure out how to become more strategic. I recommended to them that they take a look at the collective impact model, which maybe some of you are familiar with. This is promulgated by John Carney and Mark Kramer a few years ago, and it's kind of taken off like wildfire in the foundation sector. But it's a very good model. It basically says, look, first of all, you have to have a common agenda. What are you trying to get done together, okay? Well, in Milwaukee, the situation was at least an ask, let's figure out how we can make our neighborhoods better. We have to define better a bit more. Secondly, is there a shared measurement system? Do you know what you're trying to, if you're making progress, will you know how and why you're making progress through measurement? Or what you're doing together mutually reinforcing? Is what one sector is doing reinforcing another, or are you kind of contradicting each other because you're making different kind of investments in different places? Do you have a communications link so you know what's happening on a regular basis? And is there some level of support so that that's happening, what the authors call a backbone support organization? Well, as I stepped into Milwaukee, and this group had been organized called the Community Development Funders Alliance, they clearly had a common agenda, but they did not have a shared measurement system. They did not know what they were trying to accomplish by way of their ability to measure change. So I recommended that they bring in the Reinvestment Fund, and as Ira just described, they did. And they did this market value analysis. And I want to just spend a few minutes explaining how Milwaukee's using it, because I want to kind of talk about how you make the availability of good measurement of good data a live tool in a place so that people begin to really use it and understand it. And maybe a preface to this. What I find in the work that I'm doing in many cities, I'm now 20 years into a consulting practice. I work in lots of cities. The notion of using market-based data is still kind of foreign to people. We've been trained as a group, whether you're a planner or a sociologist or a business person, we've been trained mostly to use kind of demographic data, socioeconomic data. And so when Ira points out he's using property values through sales, not census data, and you see those big gaps, the use of sales data and understanding what that sales data means requires kind of a reprogramming of people's minds, it seems to me. Kind of what does this market stuff really mean in a practical way? How does it really inform policy? So what we did with the MVA, it's very simple stuff, but effective. We took the visual and put it on a large poster board, erasable poster board, okay? And we began to look at it and say, what does this mean in terms of, A, what people are now doing? So we went and mapped all the places where foundations or the city were making neighborhood-based investments and asked the question, does what you're doing in those places seem to match the market conditions? Now that we understand what those market conditions are, do you have the right treatment plan for the neighborhood based on the market conditions? The second thing we asked ourselves was, where are what I call the seams in the markets? So these places that are circled and numbered are places where, if you look carefully, it's hard for you to see in this, but here's a yellow area, both sides a stronger area. So the question is, well, what could be done in that area to kind of help that neighborhood in between get stronger if the neighboring blocks are strong? Say it the opposite way. How do you make sure that this weak area doesn't begin to spread into the stronger areas? Over here, there was a very clear demarcation. Maybe you can even see that from the back of the room. One side of the street is blue and purple and is very strong. This side is mixed, different, historically different. The housing stock's pretty much the same. So the question we asked, what kind of intervention might be appropriate and possible based on that seam, working with neighbors to get this strength to kind of help this area get stronger, or again, I can say it in the converse, to make sure this weaker area doesn't spread to the stronger area. And what is it about that seam historically Who are the neighborhood-based groups working in that area? Are they talking together? Do they see a common agenda? How do we make that happen in that location? So we looked at those themes. We also kind of said to the city, and actually we took this poster board and went from place to place with it. We brought it to city government and the housing department and said, does this seem right to you? Does it seem like it's describing correctly what these different market conditions are? And therefore, can you see using this to help make some judgments about where you ought to be targeting your programs? So what's been happening in Milwaukee is, first, there's a program that the Greater Milwaukee Foundation has been operating called the Healthy Neighborhoods Program. It's based on a program at Baltimore that is working in these orange and yellow neighborhoods, these neighborhoods that are kind of in the middle that could go either way. If they're left untreated, in 10 years they might be red. In a couple of cases, maybe they're going to get healthy on their own. Not worth taking the risk. Very simple program. Works with neighbors to help them market the neighborhood better, to do some public improvements, kind of self-help kind of stuff, gardening, cleaning lots. Just changes the psychology in the neighborhood so that the current residents want to stay longer and see a future in the neighborhood rather than decline, and a way of trying to attract new homeowners and new investment in the neighborhood. So what happened was the people that operate that program looked and said, there's a couple places where we think we can graduate the neighborhood that we've been working with, because it's clear that they've gotten to a point where the neighborhood's stable. They're no longer yellow. They're into the blue category. Let's move on. There's some other areas like these areas around the seams that they're working on as new candidates for this program, because this information has told them that they may be the right places. Similarly, the city has a program called the Targeted Investment Neighborhoods, where the city is bringing special programs for housing improvement, rental, and home ownership. They've now used the market value analysis to make decisions about where to place that program. And the city is also using this as a way of customizing interventions related to foreclosed properties, both mortgage foreclosures and tax foreclosed properties, as they figure out kind of what the treatment plan needs to be based on this. So it's required some socialization. It's required taking the work that the Reinvestment Fund has done and making it live in the community, helping people digest it, helping people understand it, helping them validate it, and on that basis figuring out how they can make decisions based on this data, and step by step, because there are constituencies that want to protect programs where they exist. When you bring it into a city government situation, you've got typically a city council that's often concerned with, is everybody getting what they need? But it is becoming clear in Milwaukee that this is a more rational way of making decisions. And it does help, back to the collective impact model, it helps the different sectors figure out how they can align their resources, put them in targeted areas to be helpful. And there's also saying, it's not just about these yellow and orange areas, but back into the deep distress is reinforcing to the foundations that are fundamentally in the process of trying to help with programs that are effectively about employment and about literacy and a whole set of programs that don't have to do with real estate or changing markets, that those programs belong in those red areas, as well as helping them find, when they're concerned with moving markets, where are those nodes of strength in those distressed areas so they can move forward. So we're making progress. Again, just to kind of report, still a long way to go. I think the programs are still pretty much side by side. We're still integrating what this data means, finding ways to update it, using another tool that the Reinvestment Fund has that, remind me what it's called. Policy Map, right, thank you. The Policy Map tool, which is a web-based platform that allows for a level of updating of data and understanding what's happening on a regular basis. So I think I think Milwaukee is a very good example of kind of how to use it. I missed one other key constituency that we talked with. We shared all this with the neighborhood leadership, all right? Help them understand what, from their perspective, this meant in terms of what they're doing in their neighborhoods, also in terms of validating it, as Ira said earlier, but also what does it mean from a neighborhood perspective, because you're trying to connect kind of the grassroots with the grass tops, the foundations and city government, so that there is an overall customization of approaches that makes sense to everybody in the city. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Braverman. I'm Deputy Commissioner in Baltimore City for Baltimore Housing. I handle the permits and code enforcement operations in Baltimore. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we use this stuff to inform our code enforcement intervention. So I know you didn't think code enforcement was interesting. I'm going to show you over the next 10 minutes how interesting code enforcement can really be. Because we're going to look at one tool that we have. In my operations, I have the demolition, the permitting, the housing inspections, the litigation, all reporting up, and how we can use that and the market value analysis to tailor interventions in particular. So again, we start. IRA is sort of, it's kind of like this is the discussion of the apotheosis of IRA here, as we all talk about the great work that TRF does. But, that's a starting point. So getting that work in Baltimore is a jumping off point for allowing us to tailor our interventions. And, it's a great offense. What are we going to do? It's a great defense on the back end. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because those are the interventions that make sense understanding our markets. So at the 10,000-foot level, I'd like to think of Baltimore as a thriving city that has some distressed areas. And I think the MVA analysis bears that out to some degree. But at 10,000 feet, we have lost essentially a third of our population in Baltimore City. As a result, we have 16,000 vacant buildings. We have very good data on what our vacant buildings are. We're not talking about the census data. We're not talking about the post office data. We're talking about buildings that our housing inspectors have been to and have determined meet the standard of vacant and unsafe in our building code and have issued a violation notice. So we've got down to the block and lot really good data about where our vacant buildings are. But it's obvious. We've lost 350,000 people. We're going to have a fair number of product for which there's no demand. So what is that? What do we know about where it's located? So in Baltimore City, we know that there's roughly, based on the MVA, and we're going to see that in a second, and again, some of the MVA is telling us what anybody would know, kicking tires or living in Baltimore City, that 12,000 of those vacants are really in areas that we would call distressed using the MVA and that really have no market demand. They're not likely to come back for housing at any time soon. There's probably about 3,200 vacants. That's a lot in areas where there is market demand. And there's about 1,200 vacants in what Ira and Paul and I think everyone's been talking about is in distressed areas yet proximate enough to nodes of strength that one would expect that there could be development interest and successful, sustainable markets created there. So here's our MVA in Baltimore. So we've seen Milwaukee's. Here's where the vacant buildings are. And they're obviously in Baltimore, vacant buildings are a pretty good proxy for the strength or relative weakness of the markets. So in our areas that are most distressed, these vacants are going to overlay the most orange areas on the map. Those are the areas where we talked about the bulk of the vacants with limited market demand. You can see vacants sort of scattered in other stronger markets around the city. So if we're just talking about code enforcement and we're using data to drive interventions, we could say, here's a bunch of, actually, let me jump to this one. Here's a bunch of areas where we know the markets are relatively strong enough to support investment in those vacant buildings. So we want to use code enforcement here in these markets to push all the vacant buildings back into the stream of commerce, because the market's strong enough to support rehab for home ownership or rental. We just got to get them right back into the market. Now, that's not going to be the solution in the most distressed area, because there is no market to get them back into. So in other areas, I'm going to go back, demolition makes sense. Strategic, targeted demolition used in a way to get best possible outcomes in terms of stabilizing what can be stabilized and leveraging investment where we can where we can leverage it. But if you look where our targeted demolition is for some of the recent demolition dollars we've got, Mayor Rawlings Blake has committed more demolition dollars than any mayor in recent times, and it's no surprise where those demolition dollars would end up being if you're using a data-driven intervention. And if you saw an Ira's selection of options in his menu at the end in our distressed areas, demolition would be a sensible data-driven intervention, and that maps here. Here's our code enforcement interventions. And then there's also, again, nodes of strength in even our most distressed markets. So here's where developers have come, even in our most distressed markets, and said, this is proximate to a node of strength, a park, transit-oriented development, a major redevelopment area, a major employer. So if you notice, most of them cluster here on the east side. And there's a reason for that, even though the markets are distressed. But there has been a very traditional intervention that most cities have in their toolkit, have used over the years. Baltimore's used very successfully in collaboration with the Johns Hopkins University and the Casey Foundation, a major redevelopment in East Baltimore around Johns Hopkins University medical institutions, which are on the east side, in one of the most distressed markets in Baltimore City. One of the measures of success for an intervention like that, which, by the way, is a big, lumbering giant that takes a long time to get off the ground and to move forward. So one of the interventions is if there is developer-driven interest in the periphery. So what this map is showing us is that in the periphery of the EBDI intervention, we have developers, and led in a very, very intentional way by TRF and their development operations. We're very lucky in Baltimore to have them investing, but we have a wide array of investors piggybacking on that. And so the success of this major redevelopment is the creation of markets on the perimeter. What does code enforcement do? If we know there's developer interest in a distressed market, code enforcement has a different intervention than we would use in these stronger markets, because in the stronger markets, we're going to want to get those properties out into the stream of commerce as quickly as possible, but with the understanding that these markets have not been distressed over the decades and long term. There's likely a warm body on the other end of that vacant, which is not true in our most distressed markets. People have died, and their estates have been probated, or their children aren't interested in the property, or the company is more or less dead that had rented it for 20 years after that. But there's really no warm body on the other end. So we use citations in our stronger markets as our first step. Let's issue a $900 parking ticket to these folks who have these vacant buildings. Let's get them to sell it and get it back into the market. There's likely to be a there that you could leverage. Remember, code enforcement works by twisting somebody's arm. It's got to be somebody there with an arm to twist, and they're more likely to be there in a market that has some vitality. So in the weakest markets, forget that. We have a code enforcement tool that allows us to ask the court to appoint a receiver to auction the property, do a title search, and by the way, if they are deceased, we have to open the estate, which does take some time, but we can do that. Doesn't matter who owns the property, alive or dead. We will move our local district court to appoint a receiver and auction the property. Now, that doesn't work in all distressed markets because there's nobody who wants to buy them, or they wouldn't be vacant in the first place. That's how weak the market is. But in these areas here, circled by blue, we know we have developers who are interested. Therefore, they're that backstop. They're capitalized. They're either for-profit or not-for-profit. And we will then proceed to use code enforcement to auction the properties, and we probably auction 35 or 40 properties a month. So we're putting out a lot of inventory in the right places, and those properties are getting redeveloped to support the revival of the market in these areas. That sounds good. But one of the jumping off point that I want to take right now is we're talking about data and how we use the MVA to inform interventions and how we have different interventions in these different areas. But that presumes that you have the capacity to execute. And that's something that cities are often relatively poor performers on. And Baltimore was no exception. So you need to building business systems is all about data. It's all about data, how to manage data, how to keep the sausage moving through the factory, and how to measure whether it's being done. So without spending much time, I don't want to leave that important point. Using data isn't just about understanding your markets and tailoring your interventions, but about building business systems so that you can intervene in effective ways. So this is just, ultimately it's all about GIS. The GIS is the window onto your data at one visual peer, and you have information that would have taken you in previous times, days. I mean, we literally used to take the plat maps and, sit on them on the copier, and they were always different scales, and tape them together and color code things in off of mainframe printouts just to get some context data, which you can get in a millisecond by looking at your GIS map. This is just an example of how our housing inspectors get 60,000 311 requests a year. They're automatically downloaded into automated business systems and in their schedule for the next day, and we respond to those within an average of 3 days. So there's 60,000 requests. Couldn't do that without business systems. We can program different business systems into our system depending on the market data. So in those stronger markets we looked at with the citations, we can write into our systems automated business processes that get the citations out. And so different processes based on different geocoding in different areas. So those business systems allow us to execute these types of interventions successfully. Well, successfully is an open question, right? So how successful are we able to do that? Data, it's another piece of using data. What data do you have so that you can evaluate, so that you can understand whether you're having the desired effect, if not why, what, if anything, you may need to do different. Being nimble in government, that sounds like two things that just don't go together, right? So it's really hard to do, but if you're not going to do that, you're just going to move forward irrespective of what the data is telling you about how effectual you are one way or another. So we will spend a lot of time pulling data, and in public operations trying to tell somebody you want a data analyst. You're the code enforcement guy, you want a data analyst? What are you going to do with a data analyst? Never mind. Because it's just, they're not going to get it. But this is the kind of thing we're going to do with data analysts. We're going to try to understand, what results we're getting so that we can evaluate the relative success of the program. It's just a long way of telling us that when we issue citations, the next purchaser, we force sales, and the next purchaser usually gets a use and occupancy. So we invert the process. At the front end, before we issue citations, we're getting use and occupancies like 30% of the time from that person and forcing a sale. The next owner in title, 65% of the time, they're getting a U of O on the front end of that operation. So the citation intervention works. This is what it's telling us in markets. This is just another data tool which I particularly like. This is like turning on the black light and watching how the vacants glow. But what this is telling me in a neighborhood in Baltimore known as Central Forest Park, for you Baltimore folks that are here up in the northwest part of the city, when we started the program, this is a snapshot of what vacants were there, what new vacants entered since we started the program, and where our interventions are currently latched onto. We're like this sort of immune system latched onto the virus. So if you take a look at Central Forest Park, it's basically this little tool is telling me, it's another use of data to help me evaluate, that We have vacant buildings being abated, the bright green. We have very few new vacant buildings, so the market's stabilized and heading in the right direction. And for the vacants that have been there since we started, almost all of them are the intervention that we've targeted here is being undertaken on those vacants. So I know the ones that we need to address, we're addressing, and it's telling me, that the market is really in the place we want it to be. And if you're living in this neighborhood, basically you have $200,000 single-family freestanding homes coming on the market by rehabbers who are buying them at receivership sales, and we have very stable folks moving into these houses in this neighborhood. So it's a sea change of difference, and we expect to see it move up in the MVA. And one of the great things is Ira has been doing this so many years in Baltimore that we have some great longitudinal data to see how things have changed. I'm going to run through this a little bit. This is Patterson Park in Baltimore City. This would be the area south of the park would be one of these streamlined code enforcement neighborhoods. You can see the market's incredibly stronger, although it has vacants. North of the park, much weaker. So as Ira and as Paul were saying, you could just turn a corner in some areas and the markets are going to change. So in the south of the city, we tried the stream right there, literally right there above the park. Those couple of blocks are relatively healthy markets, even though they've got a fair amount of vacancy in them. So we started the streamlined code enforcement activity. These are the abatements that we have seen. These are the new vacants that have come in. But what's the net been? And our net in this area is we're down 50%. So our data, this is just another use of data. We targeted this neighborhood based on the MBA. We targeted the intervention based on what made sense in this market. And now we're studying the data over a couple of years. Looks good. So we're going to keep doing what we're doing in this neighborhood. This is the area a little bit north, obviously a little bit different. Very, very strong concentration of vacants. Unfortunately, this area right up here, where they're very concentrated, is in a major redevelopment area. So a lot of those vacants are going to be taken care of through the EBTI intervention. And so as a result of that, we had developers interested in investing in these footprints. So nonprofits, including Chesapeake Habitat for Humanity, and running along Jefferson Street there, and other private investors all through that area saying, relatively stable market below, Johns Hopkins right nearby, major redevelopment. We want these vacants. So through the disposition of city-owned property, this thinking and this intervention is one part of the mayor's vacants to value approach in Baltimore City, which is using a series of different interventions tailored for the markets. And so here, the sale of city-owned property, so that developers know that they could get the city-owned property in the footprint timely. And the code enforcement intervention that we just talked about gives developers, either for-profit or not-for-profit, a predictable environment within which they can make business decisions. They could literally circle these areas that you're seeing and saying, I know I'm going to get the vacant houses. Whether I get them or not, they're going to be pushed out into commerce. Somebody's going to buy them and develop them. So if I'm doing rental, if I'm doing home ownership, I know that my investment's protected, that my buyers are going to know that the whole block is going to get done. And so this is just how over the years, everybody wants in on this. And this is how it's grown in just the 3 years since we started it. It's now this intervention, which is different from the one below it, has grown to this size. Here's the abatements and the new vacants, because it's a continuum of activity. But the net is down in the first phase 43%. So it's telling us, in all phases combined, 30%, that the data is telling us the interventions are successful. We put all this information on the web. Almost everything we're talking about is accessible to communities and to developers and to nonprofits who want to know, what are we doing about any vacant? So you go to baltimorehousing.org, and any vacant in any of these targeted areas will be there, along with the strategy, where it is in the process, what's coming up for auction, and then some roll-up data that you see here. And with that, I think we want to turn it back over to you, Karen.
Okay. So I think our panel did a great job of kind of laying out a whole bunch of information about how to use data, when to use data, some of the challenges and obstacles. I'm going to ask just one question so that you guys can start thinking and jotting down exactly what you would like to ask and talk to and discuss with this panel. We have a microphone here. When you do come up to the microphone, we ask that you share your name and the organization you're with, just to give us a little context for the question that you're bringing to us. But just to start out, I think we all touched on this a couple of different ways and in different times. But if you could share some examples of either the city that you're working for or cities that you've worked with and how they have moved forward in making a decision about using data. And second, then, not only about using data to make decisions, but then also to have the political will to act on what the data is telling them. And I don't know if any one of you wanted to start off with an example of kind of what did that entail and how did that kind of advance?
You want to go?
Sure. So one example, I think, to speak to Karen's question, might be the city of St. Louis, where we've most recently worked. We're working there with some colleagues from the Cloudburst Group who had been involved in providing HUD technical assistance to the city of St. Louis for a while. A little bit of context. It's a city of 300 or so thousand people. It was probably double its size not all that long ago. And it's a city that's carved up into, I think it's 28 or 29 aldermanic districts. And so their history had been that they would take the flow of funds that would come into the city of St. Louis, let's say their block grant dollars, and just make a decision which was, we're just going to divide this money up by 28, and each aldermanic district would get its share. The problem was that it was never at a level that was sufficiently large to make any sort of reasonable impact at all in any of the places. And so, in a way, their attempt at being equitable, if that's what they were attempting, their attempt at being equitable was thwarting any efforts of being effective in any place at all. And so the city and Cloudburst and HUD decided that it was time that they do things differently. They had a good culture of collecting data there. In other words, unlike some cities where we work, the actual data that the city had available to it was good, it was comprehensive. It was literally the first place that I went to where somebody in my initial visit to the city and an inspection of the different markets, they handed me one of these iPads with an app on it that showed me every piece of property that was owned by their housing authority, or their land bank authority. And so they had a terrific culture of data, but what they didn't have at that time was a terrific culture of necessarily using the data to develop strategies. So over the course of time, through the work that Cloudburst did with the city, Paul had been working in that city a bit, and through the creation of the market analysis, what they then did was say, let's use the data to figure out how we're going to divide this money up. HUD's not going to tolerate what we've been doing any longer. We can't tolerate it ourselves because it's not an effective strategy. So let's use the data to divide up the program, the resources that we have. And so the first thing that happened, and again, this is all very fresh, so it's an example that's probably still unfolding, but they had a set of properties that they were looking to do an RFP for. And they took each of the properties and they tagged it with the market type that the property was located in. So yellow, red, orange, blue, whatever it was, purple. They tagged it with each of those different things. And for each of those different types of markets, what they had was essentially a desire for what would be happening with the properties in those given places. So they went from, let's just divvy it up to, now let's be strategic about this. Let's recognize that we have land and we have resources and we have programs and the like, and we can sort of connect each of those things to the geography of the place, to the characteristics of the market, and then make a decision about what they want to do with it. So, that was, I thought, a really nice and fairly fast transformation given what they had been doing for a very long period of time?
My example would be Detroit, which is, the city at the end of the continuum when it comes to distress. But what I find impressive about Detroit is the amount of investment that's gone into something called Detroit Future City, which was a process that was largely funded by the Kresge Foundation, but had lots of other support, in a city that has deep, deep, deep distress. What I found is the Detroit Future City process first brought in the expertise that was needed. So, for example, what do you do with all that vacant property in Detroit? They brought in the Center for Community Progress, which is kind of the leading organization in the country focused on vacant property and vacant property recovery. Brought in on the industrial side, kind of what do you do with vacant industrial land, another mass economics to take a look at that feature, all based on very good, strong analysis data and then analysis of that data to produce a plan which is really driving the decisions in Detroit about what should be done on a kind of neighborhoods, if you will, based on a market value analysis was part of it, but a broader kind of frame based on data, so that when Detroit, as it now has a new mayor, now is coming out of bankruptcy, has a path that it can follow that is extraordinarily based on the very hard-nosed analysis of what the Detroit situation is. If you haven't had a look at it, I suggest you go to Detroit Future City, great website, take a look at this plan. I think it's a remarkable piece of work in helping to define kind of a 50-year future for a city that's in deep distress.
Great. So we want to invite questions from the audience, too, and if you can come up to the mic again, your name and your organization, that'd be very helpful.
Hi, I'm Calvin Gladney. My company's Mosaic Urban Partners. We've been working in Detroit with the market value analysis, and we actually worked with Forest City and EBDI on EBDI. So very totally on board with the use of data. My question is a bit of a concern, which is most of these neighborhoods have had either class-based or race-based disinvestment for decades. So how do we use the data to not exacerbate or make permanent the disinvestment that's been happening in these neighborhoods forever if the data takes you to the places that either have a market or have what seems to be a market, but it's the disinvestment that created, in many cases, the fact that there's no market to begin with?
You want to go?
Sure. Let me take one shot at it. I'm sure you're going to get three answers from this. Hopefully they'll be consistent. But so the way we look at it, you'll recognize that when we did the work in Detroit or we did the work in Milwaukee here or Philly or Baltimore, wherever we do it, we do the analysis for the entire city. And then what that does is it gives you a very good profile of really at a granular level of the entire place. Some of those places, as you correctly, I think correctly point out, are, as a function of race or class, have decades of disinvestment that have taken place in them. And that really is one of the very clear drivers of how they came to be what they are today. The question becomes, essentially, what do you do about that? And to my mind, what it suggests is that you think about the conditions that are in that place, and you have to think very broadly about all the resources that are available, and you have to not limit yourself to, I think as the gentleman from New Orleans pointed out in the last session, like a one-year window. So in other words, if you think about the city of Detroit or Baltimore or Philly, there are some places that are vast expanses of distress. And when I say vast, I mean like stand at an intersection and as far as your eye can see, it's chest-high grass today, unfortunately, right? And so what that suggests is that that's not a candidate for the 4 NSP rehabs that you have the ability to do in any given moment in time. What that is a candidate for is essentially something large and meaningful and catalytic on a market, not something that's going to, essentially vanish. So if you think about Detroit having places like that, and you think that, over the course of the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to have the ability to produce, for example, 1,000 very high quality, very desirable low-income housing tax credit units, for example. Those are the kinds of things that are sufficiently large and market moving that you do in places that are experiencing that kind of distress. Again, with an eye towards what is the overall future vision for the place. But again, the idea is not to try and sort of equalize. We're going to do 4 units across every place across the city. But in a place that manifests that kind of history of disinvestment, you need to hit it with something like really large and really significant and really catalytic so that it has the ability to bring that place back after it had been starved for so long.
I build from it by, I stated as a principle. So Ira mentioned in his presentation that there's a principle that says build from strength. Principle 2 is the deeper the distress, the larger the intervention needs to be. All right, so that's your 4 unit doesn't work. However, what I'm troubled by and puzzled by is the level of resources possible to do those large interventions do not generally exist. So that in Baltimore, the neighborhood, the project, if you will, renewal project that Michael mentioned by Hopkins is in fact a very large intervention and is taking 15, 20 years by the time it's done. It will change that neighborhood and will have ripple effects around it, already is. But Baltimore couldn't do more than one of those at a time. It's just the resources aren't there. I mean both the financial resources, but also kind of the civic resources to kind of do that. So I think it does get to the question of, in the meantime, what is Detroit doing, what is Baltimore doing, other cities, with land that doesn't have a market, that may not have a market for a long time, which is why I thought the Detroit Future City Plan laid out some approaches, this is my word, not their word, to kind of mothballing some areas for a while, helping them be something other than just vacant, awful places, to making them kind of vacant but better places to be, and recognizing the reality that it's got to be ready for an intervention when you can do an intervention of scale to help repopulate and rebuild the economy of that part of a city. My sense is that you want to be, who knows what will happen over the next 20, 30 years in terms of the ability, willingness of federal governments and state governments to get back in the game of kind of helping to support large levels of recovery in cities, but be ready because it might come. And having neighborhoods that are kind of poised for that, I think is a good place to be.
The only thing I think I could add to that, can't add much to what these gentlemen have to say, is that about a year and a half ago, I did a little tour. This work managed to somehow take me to France, believe it or not, where you got to see sort of the vacant property tour of France. Wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but what we were looking at is areas where governmental policies had led to sort of the concentration of poverty and where that didn't work, and what interventions they were looking to, at least in some cases, what the interventions they were looking at. So we were at a place outside of Leone, and they were looking at deconcentrating poverty and trying to readjust the infrastructure there. And the population in the area at its peak was like 25,000. Now it's down to like 13,000. And their intervention, when I asked them, how much are you spending on this? Because they had the best architects and the grandest plans. And it was about 750 million euros, which is more than $1 billion for this little part of the city. So what I think that of course tells me is they love their cities, and they have a great national urban policy. They've got regional solutions, and they're willing to spend a lot of money on it. Whereas, I tried to explain, I think our national urban policy would be summed up in that famous New York Post headline, Ford to New York, drop dead. So I think the answer is tied up in that larger question of, and which is no doubt tied up with race and class, but how we treat our cities and what resources we allocate. And what we're trying to do here is, with the limited resources that we have, how do we make sure we get the best outcomes with that? So in these neighborhoods that are distressed, that we see demolition, we can afford some demolition interventions, or leverage private dollars. What we're going to see is that the long-term homeowners there are suddenly in an area where property values are rising, and where they had no equity in their home and they couldn't leave. They would leave, but they couldn't sell their house for what rent would cost for a year. So they're stuck, prisoners in their homes. So if these interventions can create some wealth and some equity and some opportunities there and improve the quality of life on these blocks, we're not going to solve these larger problems, but we can really make some meaningful differences in neighborhoods in the city.
Great. Another question?
Emily Garpachetti from the Fund for Our Economic Future in Northeast Ohio. And I really appreciate all these presentations. I have a generally practical question. I think we can all agree, or it sounds like through the presentations, that engaging partners is important. And in order to engage partners around the data and be sure that it influences a collective strategy, you need to share the data. And so my question is, for some of the smaller foundations or community organizations, what are some of the tools that you have used to share data? I get messed up in this discussion. I know you mentioned policy map, and I'm trying to figure out a way to do this in Northeast Ohio, connecting kind of higher level economic development at the regional level to the CDCs and community groups. And I think this is where it's really a struggle. And public-private versus private, and who can translate it is all part of that.
I'll let Ira handle this, but you saw my low-tech solution to this, which was poster board.
It was beautiful.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, we just kind of marked it up and went and did it. It was a very inexpensive sharing way to go. But you probably have a more sophisticated answer than that.
No, I think that's actually a great answer. It's the answer that I grew up with, which was transparencies and all. I think sharing takes a couple different forms. One is sort of the interpersonal sharing of the information. So the sitting down with community groups and community leaders and government officials and philanthropy, and creating sort of a big table around which people can sit down and come to some common understanding of what the condition looks like. And I'll say this, not exactly on to the point of your question. I can't tell you how many times we've gone to places closest by the city of Camden a number of years ago, where people were at great odds about what to do, and about what to do about the conditions there. And I got to say that sitting down with the data about the city of Camden just removed a lot of some of the preconceived stuff about what was going to happen in this meeting, because you could start out by some shared understanding of the market reality in the place. From there, then you can have a productive discussion about what you want to do in each of the different places. But there's no more mystery about, what is it in this place? You've sort of pulled back one of the shades. So in the sharing piece of it, I do think that, there is no substitute for the sort of the interpersonal aspect of the sharing of it. But then on the electronic sharing of it, I think that there's a lot of different vehicles. Some cities that we've worked have used Policy Map, and typically the way that's structured is if the city government or the foundation or whatever has their own subscription, they can sort of push it out and people can sort of look at it freely without charge, without registration or anything else like that. And so that's one vehicle. Other cities in which we've worked, for example, New Orleans or Baltimore or St. Louis, they have terrific GIS capacity in some of those places, and they've created sort of interactive websites where they sort of content edit, like what's there, so that you're not trying to sort of look at everything, but you'll be able to see the market analysis. You might see, a layer of investment activity, et cetera, and they've created those things on their own. So I think between tools like Policy Map, which is something that we created at TRF, and I think, which I think has great value, or the things that cities that create on their own, those two things can become terrific ways of doing it. And as I said, St. Louis, I mean, literally within 24 hours of having had our sit down with the aldermen and the mayor's delegation of folks, they literally had the whole thing up. They created neighborhood profiles so that somebody could just click on it and down they would come. So it became a very productive vehicle for doing the sharing.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Great. Do we have any other questions? I think we have time.
Hi there. I'm Julia Taylor. I work with Isles in Trenton, New Jersey, and we are actually starting a process similar to what you've done in Baltimore. And the city's really on board, which is great, but some of the staff is not that excited about moving to this. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some practical strategies to help move this culture shift forward with staff, especially very overburdened staff.
Well, it starts at the top. I would say that we're pretty lucky that Mayor Rawlings Blake in Baltimore City has makes some difficult decisions, is willing to make some difficult decisions. So this using data, is the thing we haven't said is maybe the traditional approach is make sure everybody gets an equal amount of everything that comes through, and that like feeding the chicks in the nest or something, but that isn't necessarily going to get you positive outcomes. And so it starts at the top, having a mayor who's willing to essentially say that it's in the best interest of the city to make sure that we have the right interventions. And then, through the cabinet level appointments, in your planning department and your housing department, and most notably, to push that down. And so we have, the right, in our planning and housing departments, folks have fully understood the importance of doing it this way. And I think in a lot of ways, what we're saying should be common sense, really. I mean, it's really fundamentally common sense, that you need to understand your market. So it didn't come overnight, I will say. And the biggest dividing line I find is between what we're talking about and having some strong political support for it and our council, because fundamentally at the council level you could see more parochial interests in the city, and so we still have to this day sort of legislators who want to move some silver bullet solution forward because people are remain distressed about how the prevalence of vacants. The fact that there's no easy answers isn't the kind of thing politicians like to say. They like to say, I'm going to run this banner up of a split rate tax. We're going to tax all the vacant buildings at a higher rate, and then people won't hold on to them anymore, and there won't be any more vacants. And then or the dollar house, or the this or that, some other panacea, when it's more complicated than that. So I would say there's no easy answer.
But Michael, you might want to speak to the fact that what I got from the question is also on the staff. Your staff is really adjusted to and now thrives on the measurement you're doing.
Well, these are all functions of organizational leadership, right? If you're starting at the top and then pushing down, it doesn't happen overnight. But being able to communicate a clear strategic vision and attract and retain the team that you need, all those things sounds like the private sector. Trying to do that in the public sector is a big headache. But you really have to stay on it long enough to attract that type of team and keep them. I would say just about the split rate tax, because I can't resist, so excuse me. I always say, if you go to one of the most distressed parts of Baltimore City that we just saw on a map, and you find somebody in there who owns a vacant building who's actually paying taxes, I say give them a medal. Right.
Well, I want to ask you to join me in thanking our panel again today. And I also, very briefly, I think I want to recap very quickly with a couple of themes that I think were really critical about this conversation today. And it goes back to this last question and something that I think all of our panelists have said at different times. It's being really clear about what you want to accomplish, being really clear and crisp about that goals, because all along the way, you're going to have to convince somebody, whether it's someone above or below you, that using data to make rational decisions so that you can allocate the resources you have and encourage the resources that everyone else has to move in a certain direction, to have the impacts. Again, going back to the goal that you had, having the impacts that you want to have. And it's a long cultural shift that requires a lot of discipline. And it does sound very private sector. It does sound like taking the private sector to the nonprofit communities, to the local governments and the state governments even. But in the end, it's where we're being driven to. You hear pay for success. You hear evidence-based decision making. The words are all out there, and they're repeated to us time and time again, and they're repeated to us from the funders who are driving a lot of this discussion. But I think, there's also a value in hearing it from our communities who say, show me what you're doing for me. Show me that this works. There's a lot of skepticism. And so with that, I actually want to thank all of you for the questions and for joining us today, and encourage you, as I lose my voice at the perfect time, encourage you to join us for lunch. I think it's going to be a wonderful discussion. So thank you.